October 24th, 1944, 10:47 hours. 23,000 feet above Lake Gulf, the air tasted like metal and gasoline. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell pulled his oxygen mask tighter against his face as his F-6F Hellcat sliced through scattered cumulus clouds. Below him, the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly, a sheet of hammered bronze under the tropical sun. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, held formation 300 yards to his left. They'd been airborne for nearly 2 hours, their fuel gauges creeping steadily toward the red. Then McCampbell saw them. Rising from the southwest like a plague of locusts, the largest formation of Japanese aircraft he'd ever witnessed. Not a dozen, not 20. Over 60 enemy planes, Zeros, Oscars, and Judys, climbing toward the American carrier task force with murderous intent. McCampbell's throat went dry. His thumb moved to the radio transmit button. But before he could call for reinforcements, he saw something that changed his calculation entirely. The Japanese formation flew with peacetime precision, tight and beautiful and completely oblivious to the 2 American fighters above them. They expected nothing. They feared nothing. They were about to learn that American naval aviation had evolved into something their warrior code couldn't comprehend. What happened in the next 6 minutes would rewrite the record books and expose a fatal truth about empires that mistake discipline for dominance. Stay with this story, because what you're about to witness will prove that sometimes the difference between victory and annihilation comes down to 1 man, 6 minutes, and the willingness to do the impossible when everyone's counting on you. David McCampbell should never have been in that cockpit. At 34 years old, he was ancient by fighter pilot standards. The Navy preferred its combat aviators young, aggressive, and expendable. McCampbell was none of these things. He'd graduated from Annapolis in 1933, but spent the first 8 years of his career in desk jobs and training assignments. When war erupted in December 1941, he was considered too old for combat operations. His superiors saw him as competent, but unremarkable, a career officer who'd never distinguish himself. They assigned him to administrative duties at naval air stations stateside while younger men shipped out to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. McCampbell watched them go with quiet frustration. He didn't complain. He didn't protest. He simply requested a transfer to flight training every 6 months with bureaucratic persistence. Finally, in 1943, someone approved his request more out of exhaustion than faith. The Navy sent him to Advanced Fighter Tactics School expecting him to wash out. Instead, he excelled. His instructors discovered that age brought advantages youth lacked. McCampbell flew with mathematical precision. He never wasted ammunition. He never took unnecessary risks. He approached aerial combat the way a chess master approaches a tournament, studying his opponents, identifying patterns, exploiting weaknesses. By early 1944, he'd earned command of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex. His pilots called him the Old Man with affectionate respect. They had no idea they were serving under a legend in waiting, the Japanese Naval Air Force that McCampbell faced in October 1944. Bore little resemblance to the elite force that had struck Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Those original pilots, men with thousands of flight hours and years of combat experience, were dead. Shot down over the Solomons, burned alive at Midway, lost in the meat grinder of the Marianas Turkey Shoot. What remained were hastily trained replacements with barely 200 flight hours total. The institutional knowledge that made Japanese naval aviation formidable had evaporated, but Japanese military doctrine couldn't adapt to this reality. Their training still emphasized offensive aggression and spiritual determination over defensive tactics and survival skills. Young pilots were taught that dying gloriously for the emperor mattered more than living to fight another day. This philosophy had worked when Japan fought weaker opponents in China. It had even worked briefly against unprepared American forces in 1941 and early 1942, but by late 1944, it had become a suicide pact dressed up as honor. The Japanese Empire was feeding its children into a furnace that consumed them faster than the training pipeline could replace them. McCampbell and Rushing circled above the Japanese formation for precious seconds, watching, calculating. Standard doctrine called for waiting for reinforcements before engaging such overwhelming numbers. But McCampbell's tactical brain processed multiple variables simultaneously. The Japanese were heading straight for the American carriers. Every minute of delay meant they'd get closer. His radio crackled with distorted transmissions. Other American fighters were engaged elsewhere, tied up in dogfights across 50 miles of ocean. No help was coming. Not soon enough. McCampbell looked at his fuel gauge. Enough for maybe 20 minutes of combat before he'd be forced to disengage. He thought about the thousands of American sailors on those carriers below, young men who joined the Navy expecting to come home. He thought about the mission parameters, the acceptable loss ratios, the careful calculations that staff officers made in air-conditioned ready rooms. Then he pushed those thoughts aside and rolled his Hellcat into a diving attack. Rushing followed without hesitation. 2 American fighters against 60-plus Japanese aircraft. The mathematics were suicidal, but mathematics didn't account for skill disparity or technological superiority or the cold fury of men who refused to let the enemy reach their shipmates. The F-6F Hellcat that McCampbell flew represented the apex of American industrial engineering applied to naval aviation. Grumman Aircraft Corporation had designed it specifically to kill Zeros. It was heavier, more rugged, and faster in a dive than anything Japan could field. Its 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute. A 1-second burst put nearly 75 rounds into the air. The Hellcat could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and armored cockpit protected pilots from the catastrophic fires that turned Japanese aircraft into flying coffins. But the real advantage wasn't mechanical. It was philosophical. American aircraft designers assumed pilots were valuable resources worth protecting. Japanese designers assumed pilots were expendable components willing to die. This fundamental difference in how each culture valued human life manifested in every rivet and fuel line. The Hellcat was built to bring its pilot home. The Zero was built to deliver its pilot to a glorious death. These contradictory philosophies were about to collide at 350 miles per hour. McCampbell's first pass came from above and behind, exploiting the sun's glare. He'd studied Japanese formations during previous engagements and identified a critical weakness. They flew beautiful geometric patterns that looked impressive but limited individual maneuverability. Wingmen stayed locked in position, unable to break formation without dishonoring their section leaders. This rigidity created blind spots. McCampbell dove into one of these blind spots, selected a trailing Zero, and opened fire at 200 yards. His tracer rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter's wing root exploded. It tumbled sideways, trailing smoke and flame. McCampbell's second burst caught another Zero that had turned to investigate. The range was close, less than 100 yards. The effect was catastrophic. The Zero's canopy shattered. Its pilot slumped forward. The aircraft entered a flat spin toward the ocean for miles below. 2 kills in 15 seconds. The Japanese formation fragmented into confusion. Some pilots broke left, others broke right. Their section leaders tried to restore order by radio, but the American attack had come from an impossible angle. They'd been taught to watch for attackers from ahead and below, the traditional approach vector. McCampbell had violated their expectations. Now chaos spread through their ranks like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Ensign rushing engaged simultaneously, his guns hammering another Zero to pieces. But he was young and aggressive and made a critical error. He followed his target down, chasing the kill instead of maintaining altitude advantage. 3 Japanese fighters pounced on him immediately. McCampbell saw Rushing's Hellcat twisting desperately, trying to shake his pursuers. Standard procedure called for McCampbell to assist his wingman, but cold tactical calculation overrode emotion. If McCampbell dove to help Rushing, he'd sacrifice the altitude advantage that made this entire engagement survivable. He made the hardest decision a commander faces. He stayed high and continued killing Japanese aircraft, trusting Rushing's aircraft and skill to keep him alive. This wasn't callousness, it was mathematics. McCampbell could either save one pilot or stop 60 enemy aircraft from reaching the carriers. The equation was brutal. His conscience would deal with the cost later. Right now, he had a job to do. The third Zero died at 300 yards. McCampbell's deflection shot perfect despite the extreme angle. The pilot never saw what killed him. The fourth fell 30 seconds later, caught in a climbing turn that bled energy. McCampbell simply waited for the Zero to stall, then fired a 3-second burst that shredded the cockpit. By now, the Japanese formation had completely disintegrated. Individual aircraft scattered across 10,000 cubic feet of sky, their carefully planned attack reduced to a terrified rout. But they still outnumbered McCampbell 50-1. Zeros began converging on him from multiple angles. This was the moment his age and experience mattered most. Younger pilots might have panicked. McCampbell flew with mechanical efficiency, using the Hellcat's superior speed to maintain separation while picking off targets with surgical precision. He never wasted ammunition. Every burst counted. Every shot was aimed. He'd fire, kill, and be repositioning before the dying aircraft hit the water. Japanese radio communications during the battle, later intercepted and translated, revealed profound confusion. Pilots reported multiple American fighters attacking from all directions. Some claimed they'd seen at least 10 Hellcats. Others insisted it was a full squadron. The psychological impact of McCampbell's tactics magnified his physical presence. By constantly changing attack angles and altitudes, he created the illusion of overwhelming force. The Japanese pilots, already demoralized by months of losing battles, saw what they expected to see: American numerical superiority crushing them once again. The reality, one man in one aircraft killing them with methodical precision, never occurred to them. Their training hadn't prepared them for individual excellence. It had prepared them for group cohesion. When that cohesion shattered, so did their effectiveness. The fifth kill came at 10:49 hours. McCampbell had been in continuous combat for 2 minutes that felt like 2 hours. His ammunition counters showed half his load expended. He needed to make every bullet count. A Judy dive bomber, separated from its escorts, crossed his nose at 400 yards. McCampbell led the target perfectly, firing a short burst that hit the Judy's engine. Smoke poured from the cowling. The bomber nosed over and plunged toward the sea. McCampbell didn't watch it die. He was already acquiring his next target. A Zero had gotten on his 6 o'clock, the pilot skilled enough to match McCampbell's turns. Tracers flickered past the Hellcat's canopy. McCampbell performed a maneuver that defied Japanese tactical doctrine. Instead of turning to escape, he chopped his throttle and extended his landing gear. The sudden deceleration caused the pursuing Zero to overshoot. McCampbell retracted his gear, firewalled his throttle, and put a 5-second burst into the Zero from point-blank range. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. Pieces of aluminum and burning fuel sprayed past McCampbell's cockpit. That made 6. Ensign Rushing's voice crackled over the radio, strained but alive. He'd managed to shoot down 2 of his pursuers and was diving for the deck, headed back toward the carriers with battle damage, but still airborne. McCampbell felt relief wash through him. He hadn't lost his wingman, but there was no time to celebrate. More Zeros were climbing to engage him. His fuel gauge now showed critical levels. He had maybe 5 minutes before he'd be forced to disengage or risk running dry. Every instinct screamed at him to break off, head home, claim his 6 kills, and survive to fight another day. But the Japanese formation, though scattered, was still pressing toward the American fleet. He could see them below, regrouping, preparing to continue their attack run. McCampbell made his second impossible decision of the day. He dove back into the fight, and he kept killing. The 7th aircraft fell at 10:53 hours. 6 minutes had elapsed since McCampbell's first attack. In those 6 minutes, he'd fundamentally altered the tactical situation. What should have been a coordinated Japanese strike on the American carriers had devolved into a disorganized gaggle of frightened pilots trying desperately to survive. Some were fleeing westward. Others milled around in confusion. A few brave souls still attempted to press the attack, but without coordination, they were simply targets. McCampbell selected one of these determined pilots, a Zero whose flight path indicated he was heading for the nearest carrier. The range was long, nearly 500 yards. McCampbell's ammunition was critically low. He had maybe enough for 2 more bursts. He steadied his aircraft, compensated for deflection and gravity drop, and squeezed the trigger. The tracers arced through the sky. Most missed, but 3 rounds found the Zero's fuel tank. The explosion was instantaneous and total. The aircraft became a fireball that tumbled toward the ocean, trailing black smoke. 7 kills, 6 minutes. Impossible numbers that would be verified by gun camera footage and witness testimony. McCampbell's fuel warning light illuminated red. He had no choice now. Disengage or die. He rolled the Hellcat onto a southeasterly heading and pushed the throttle to maximum cruise, trying to balance speed against fuel consumption. Below him, the remaining Japanese aircraft continued their confused attempts to attack the American fleet. But now other American fighters were arriving, fresh from their own engagement or scrambled from the carriers. The sky filled with dogfights. The Japanese attack that might have succeeded if it had hit with coordinated fury instead arrived piecemeal and disorganized. American anti-aircraft fire shredded the attackers. The few that got through inflicted minimal damage. The battle that should have been a disaster became a victory, and it started with one man's refusal to accept defeat. McCampbell's Hellcat touched down on the Essex's flight deck with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. The engine coughed and died as he taxied clear of the resting wires. His crew chief stared at the empty ammunition counters with disbelief. Flight deck personnel surrounded the aircraft as McCampbell climbed stiffly from the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the high-altitude cold. His hands shook slightly from adrenaline dump. The Air Group intelligence officer approached with a clipboard, ready to debrief. "How many, Skipper?" he asked. McCampbell thought carefully. He'd seen 7 aircraft go down under his guns, but combat was chaotic. Maybe some had been hit by other fighters. Maybe some had recovered and made it home. He was about to claim 6 when Ensign Rushing landed and taxied alongside. Rushing had witnessed the entire engagement. "7, sir," Rushing said firmly. "I saw all 7, and probably saved 5,000 lives doing it." The intelligence officer wrote it down. 7 confirmed kills, 6 minutes of combat. A record that would stand for decades. The gun camera footage told a story that words couldn't capture. Frame by frame, it showed McCampbell's precision. No wasted shots. No spray and pray desperation. Each burst was controlled, aimed, effective. Aviation analysts studying the footage later calculated his hit percentage at nearly 40%. Extraordinary given the chaos of aerial combat. They also noted something else. McCampbell never broke his attacks even when enemy fighters got on his tail. He trusted his aircraft's superiority and his own skill. This confidence, born from maturity and experience, gave him a crucial edge. Younger pilots might have panicked when surrounded. McCampbell simply executed his training with mechanical perfection. The analysts concluded that age wasn't a liability in fighter combat. It could be an asset if the pilot remained physically capable and mentally sharp. Asterisk, the Japanese perspective on the October 24th engagement emerged from post-war interrogations and captured documents. Surviving pilots described the attack as a nightmare. They'd expected to encounter routine American fighter resistance, perhaps a dozen Hellcats that they could overwhelm through numbers and fighting spirit. Instead, they'd faced what seemed like an entire squadron of expert pilots who killed with surgical precision. The psychological impact shattered morale across the Japanese carrier air groups. Young pilots who survived the engagement wrote in their diaries about the futility of fighting an enemy with such material and technological superiority. Some questioned whether spiritual determination could really overcome American firepower. These doubts, once unthinkable in the Imperial Japanese Navy, spread like poison through units already decimated by losses. The warrior code that emphasized glorious death over pragmatic survival began cracking. not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because courage without competence only created corpses. McCampbell's 7 kills in 6 minutes became part of a larger narrative that historians would later call the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was the largest naval engagement in history, involving hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft across thousands of square miles of ocean. American forces decisively defeated the Japanese, destroying their carrier capability and breaking the back of their naval aviation. But massive battles are composed of thousands of individual actions, small moments that shift the balance. McCampbell's 6 minutes represented one such moment: his refusal to be intimidated by overwhelming odds, his willingness to engage when retreat was the sensible option, his skill in exploiting every advantage his aircraft and training provided. These individual choices, multiplied across thousands of American servicemen, created aggregate outcomes that determined which empire would dominate the Pacific. The symbolism of McCampbell's achievement extended beyond personal heroism. He flew an aircraft that represented American industrial capacity. The Hellcat wasn't artistically beautiful like the Zero. It was functional, practical, designed by engineers who valued effectiveness over elegance. Grumman could produce Hellcats at a rate that stunned Japanese planners. While Japan struggled to manufacture a few dozen fighters per month, American factories turned out hundreds. This industrial advantage meant that every Hellcat lost could be replaced within days. Every pilot killed received a replacement fresh from training. The Japanese had no such luxury. Their factories were being bombed. Their fuel supplies were being submarines. Their training pipeline had collapsed under the weight of impossible demands. McCampbell's 7 kills didn't just remove 7 aircraft from Japanese inventory. They removed 7 irreplaceable pilots whose skills represented months of training Japan couldn't afford. The contrast between McCampbell's approach to combat and Japanese tactical doctrine revealed fundamental cultural differences. McCampbell fought to win and survive. He used his aircraft's advantages ruthlessly. He avoided fair fights in favor of advantageous engagements. He valued effectiveness over honor, results over glory. This pragmatism horrified Japanese officers trained in Bushido traditions. They saw American tactics as cowardly. Real warriors faced their enemies directly, accepted equal risks, fought with spiritual purity rather than material advantage. But this romantic view of warfare collided catastrophically with industrial-age reality. Wars weren't won by spiritual determination. They were won by nations that could produce more weapons, train more soldiers, and apply overwhelming force at critical moments. Japan's warrior culture, forged in centuries of isolated feudal conflict, proved disastrously unsuited for total war against industrial democracies. MC Campbell received the Medal of Honor for his actions on October 24, 1944. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous intrepidity, but couldn't quite capture the essential nature of what he'd accomplished. He demonstrated that individual excellence mattered even in mass industrial warfare. That one skilled pilot in a superior aircraft could achieve effects far beyond what numbers suggested. That American emphasis on individual initiative and personal responsibility created combat multipliers that authoritarian systems couldn't replicate. These lessons extended far beyond aviation tactics. They revealed something fundamental about how democratic and authoritarian systems approached warfare differently. The war ended less than a year after McCampbell's 6 minutes over Leyte Gulf. By then, he'd increased his total to 34 confirmed aerial victories, making him the Navy's top ace. But those 7 kills in 6 minutes remained the achievement that defined his career. Not because the numbers were extraordinary, though they were, but because they represented a perfect crystallization of what made American forces effective. Superior equipment wielded by individually competent personnel who understood their mission and possessed the initiative to accomplish it without detailed orders. This combination, technological advantage plus individual agency, proved unstoppable. McCampbell survived the war and lived until 1996, dying at age 86. He never sought publicity for his achievements. When asked about that day over light golf, he'd shrug and say he did his job. This humility, too, represented something distinctly American. Democratic cultures are suspicious of heroes who claim too much credit. They prefer individuals who acknowledge luck, teamwork, and circumstance. McCampbell understood that his 7 kills resulted from factors beyond personal skill. He flew the right aircraft. He received the right training. He benefited from industrial capacity that provided unlimited ammunition and fuel. He served in a military culture that rewarded individual initiative rather than punishing deviation from rigid doctrine. All these advantages combined to create that 6-minute window where one man could change the course of a battle. The Hellcat McCampbell flew that day was later recovered from storage and restored. It now sits in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. The aircraft's skin still shows patches where battle damage was repaired. The guns are disabled but present. Visitors can peer into the cockpit where McCampbell sat during those 6 impossible minutes. They can see the gun sight he used to aim, the stick he pulled, the throttle he manipulated with mathematical precision. But what they can't see is the accumulated experience that made those 6 minutes possible. The thousands of flight hours, the rigorous training, the cultural values that taught a boy from Alabama that individual excellence mattered. That rules existed to be followed until circumstances demanded they be broken. That survival and victory weren't contradictory goals. The ghost of David McCampbell still flies over light golf in the memories of historians who studied that battle. You can find him in every tactical debrief that emphasizes individual initiative over rigid adherence to doctrine. You can find him in aircraft design philosophies that protect pilots rather than treating them as expendable. You can find him in the understanding that sometimes the right person in the right place with the right tools can accomplish the impossible. Most importantly, you can find him in the recognition that democratic values aren't just political abstractions. They're practical advantages in warfare. Societies that value individual lives produce soldiers who fight to win and survive. Societies that demand glorious death produce corpses. 6 minutes, 7 kills. One man who refused to accept that numbers determined outcomes. That's not just a war story. That's the story of why free people eventually defeat empires that mistake obedience for strength.